Is the outcome of the Ukraine war just decided by JP Morgan? Well, we're just now past the 1-year anniversary of the Ukraine war, and it has no signs of slowing down. In fact, it's more scary, more dangerous, and more uncertain than ever. But leave it to the bankers like JP Morgan to show us what the potential outcomes are. That is, if you know your history. So in this video, I'm going to break down the latest suspect move from Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan, what deal they struck with Ukraine, and then I'm going to give you one of my famous guided history lessons. I'm going to show you how JP Morgan already did this before in a previous war, how it worked out, and what the outcome of that was. They say history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. But after watching this video, you might say no, it actually repeats. And it might tell us how this whole Ukraine war ends up. So let's go. All right, welcome back. If you're new to the channel, my name is Mark Moss, and I make these videos to change the way you think about money because almost everything we've learned is wrong, and it's hard to see things right. Now, you might not recognize me because I'm sitting at a desk. Normally, I'm behind my whiteboard. If you'd like to see more videos like this at my desk, I also make more like news opinion videos a couple times a week on my secondary channel called Market Disruptors. We'll link to it in the description down below, Market Disruptors. We do a few videos a week, more like news-based commentary. If you like that stuff, go check out that video. But back to this, what are the banksters telling us about the future of the Ukraine war? So, the banksters, I like to call them that. They're at it again. And of course, it starts with the most powerful bank and the most powerful bankster in the world, and that's Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan. And it looks like history is rhyming, and it could actually be repeating. So what do I mean by all this? Well, to start to understand this, let's take a look at the recent headline that read, quote, JP Morgan reaches agreement with Ukraine's Zelensky on rebuilding infrastructure. And then the article goes on to say that, quote, JP Morgan believes that attracting private capital will be the key to Ukraine's ability to fight off Russian aggression, end quote. So if they get lots of private banks to give money to Ukraine, then Russia will be scared away? I guess that's what they mean, but let's keep going to get to the juicy part. So directly from the article, it goes on to say, quote, JP Morgan bankers discussed the creation of a fund seeded with $20 to $30 billion in private capital, end quote. And it goes on to even say that, quote, the creation of a bank administered by Wall Street firms that would make investments in oil refineries, roads, bridges, and other pieces of economic infrastructure. Now, this new pledge of $30 billion is new, but JP Morgan's been involved in Ukraine for a long time. In fact, going back to 2010, JP Morgan's been deeply involved helping Ukraine weather financial crises which predate the war. And last year, it led to a national debt restructuring of more than $20 billion. Jamie Dimon even said, quote, the full resources of JP Morgan Chase are available to Ukraine. Now, while JP Morgan may claim that they're simply following their incentives and helping to rebuild Ukraine, you have to keep in mind that any deal they make before the war ends puts all the US dollar holders at risk, because if Ukraine loses, how will they pay those loans back? But I'm sort of getting ahead of myself here, so let's jump back into history and see what the banksters and JP Morgan specifically have been up to in situations like this in the past. Now, I'm sure you already know, bankers always find a way to profit from war. In fact, some might even say that bankers want to even cause wars for profit, but let's look at the historical facts, and I'm going to leave you to draw your own conclusions from this. So banking, especially central banking, has a very special history that's intertwined with the history of warfare. As a matter of fact, the first central bank, which was the Bank of England, was incorporated by the Act of Parliament in 1694 with the immediate purpose of raising funds for England. And that was to allow the English government to wage war against France. After England was defeated by the French in the Battle of Beachy Head in 1690, King William III wanted the government to build a naval fleet to rival the French Navy. But the ability to actually build these ships was held back by, small little details that was like they didn't have enough money. And this is why the Bank of England was formed. The rich guys came to the king and said, hey, we'll make you a deal. Here's the deal. we're going to give you as much money as you need to build that Navy. But what we need in return is that you need to give us a charter for a bank, and you need to make a law that the money we make is the new money and everyone should use it. And the king's like, so I got to do that, and you'll give me as much money as I want? And they said, yeah. And now there you have it. Now we have fiat money. And so loaning money isn't the only way these banks or banksters make a profit. They can create the money, they can loan the money, and they have dozens of ways. In fact, besides direct lending to the governments, banks profit from war from other channels like collecting commissions by helping these warring governments to sell their war bonds. They also profit from financing the war, providing goods, providing services to the military. So they help the war get really big and really messy, and then they go on a long time. And then the banks also profit from financing the reconstruction after the war has ruined the country's infrastructure. Okay, so now that we've framed that up, let's jump back in time. Let's see exactly how this played out. Let's go all the way back to the early 1900s. And we were in World War I. It was raging throughout Europe. And we had France and England. They were facing off against Germany. And the problem was, like always, they needed money to wage the war. But no worries. Here comes JP Morgan and their, banking buddies. JP Morgan made a killing providing loans and selling their war bonds for them, both in advertising fees and commissions. And then JP Morgan also arranged for the spending of all that freshly borrowed money because, of course, they needed supplies, right? So JP Morgan loaned them the money and then received the money back in exchange for all the supplies they needed, of course, through their own companies. Now, of course, throughout the whole thing, JP Morgan claimed to be a pacifist, of course, right? He said, nobody could hate war more than I do. That's what he said to the Senate Munitions Committee. So he hated the fact that he had to loan money and then receive it back. And he really hated the fact that he had a net profit of $9 million on a single deal, and that was in 1915. That was $1915, which, by the way, is worth about $300 million today. And of course, he kept racking it up again and again. In 1917, the French government paid to JP Morgan and other banks a commission of $1.5 million and a further million again in 1918. And it gets better. At least it gets better for JP Morgan because besides the issue of loans, there was another source of profit. It was the purchase and sale of American stock, which the Allies surrendered so that they could buy the munitions they needed from the United States. It's estimated that over the course of the year, some $2 billion passed through JP Morgan's hands in this way, which in today's dollars is over $60 billion. Even if the commission was small, transaction of this size gave him massive influence on the stock market, which gave him huge advantages. But this is just the start of where this story goes. And if you want to understand what is likely to happen in Ukraine, you have to understand the next part. You see, England and France, they were losing the war to Germany, which is, as you might imagine, it would be a huge hit and it would be a devastating blow for JP Morgan because how are they going to get paid back, all that money if France and England lost the war? So they had to win, right? But they didn't really have a chance unless maybe like the United States got involved. But the problem with that is that the U.S. didn't want to get into a war, right? I mean, why would they? But JP Morgan had a plan. Now, it's important to note that just 10 months prior, then President Wilson won the presidency because he, quote, kept the U.S. out of war. But good old Colonel House secretly negotiated an agreement with England to get the U.S. into the battle. But there was no public support for it. Everyday Americans didn't want a war overseas. They didn't want the taxes. They didn't want to send their fathers, their sons, their brothers to go die overseas. So that was a problem. But of course, no problem is too big for the banksters. So what do you think JP Morgan did? Well, he needed the public support, so he cornered the U.S. media networks. Of course, he took control of Harper Brothers Publishing House, Pierpont Morgan, New York Sun, Boston News Bureau, Barron's Magazine, of course, the Wall Street Journal, for starters. And then, of course, as you might imagine, the U.S. press started to get really warm and fuzzy about the U.S. going to war overseas. Seems kind of suspect. Now, there was a cry to take up arms against the enemy of Western civilization. That sound familiar? an enemy of Western civilization? So media outlets start sounding off, the alarm starts sounding off on this patriotic duty of all Americans to defend, quote, world democracy. That's what they said back then. Sound familiar? And all across the nation, there was massive preparedness demonstrations. There was parades being organized. And so the stage was set with kindling, ready to burn. All that was needed was a spark. And a spark they got. On October 1914, Winston Churchill issued orders that British merchant ships should no longer obey a German U-boat order to halt or be searched. And if they had armament, they were supposed to engage the enemy. Now, a U-boat is a submarine. Now, if they didn't do that, they were supposed to then ram the submarine. And as you might expect, the immediate result of this change was to force the German U-boats to remain submerged for the protection so they wouldn't get sunk, and then they would ram the boats without warning. And then, again, as you might suspect, to increase the likelihood of accidentally, sinking a ship with from a neutral great power, Churchill then ordered British ships to remove their names from the holes. When they were in port, they were supposed to fly a neutral power flag, preferably of the United States. And of course, they needed to provoke them more. And so then the British Navy was ordered to treat captured U-boat crew members not as prisoners of war, but as felons. Well, what do you think would happen because of this? And by the way, this is all part of the now embarrassing official Navy archives. But it turns out a boat full of Americans was sunk. And some evidence even supports the infamous ship, the Lithuania, was actually a false flag operation. But not just jumping to conclusions, because what's important is that this is all needed to get the U.S. to jump into World War I. Now, as soon as the news of the ship's sinking got broadcast across the United States, which of course J.P. Morgan owned, it got broadcast by the American media machine, then the American people got all riled up, and ultimately Congress couldn't resist the combined power of the media and the president, and ultimately declared war on April 16th, 1917. Now, J.P. Morgan was almost bankrupt. As England and France, they were losing. But within 8 days of that, Congress passed the War Loan Act, which extended $1 billion in credit to the Allies. Now, the first advance of $200 million went to the British, and the next day was immediately applied as payment on the debt that it owed J.P. Morgan. A few days later, $100 million went to France for the same purpose, but the drain continued. Within 3 months, the British had run up their overdraft with J.P. Morgan to $400 million, and the firm presented it to the government for payment. So now the government's paying J.P. Morgan. Now, this is all a matter of fact. It's all in historical records. In fact, 20 years after the war, the U.S. Senate conducted an investigation into the cause of World War I and why the United States actually entered it. It was called the Nye Committee. Now, after nearly 2 years of investigation, the committee found that between 1915 and January 1917, the United States lent Germany $27 million. And at the same time, the United States lent the United Kingdom, France, and their allies $2.3 billion, nearly 100 times as much. So they were playing both sides. Now, the profits that the Wall Street banks made from these war loans, they were enormous, right? And they began before the war even started. Now, a key finding of the Nye Committee was that J.P. Morgan and other Wall Street financiers gave money to England, France, Russia, and Germany during World War I. They profited by playing both sides when their bets started going bad. Now, they were bailed out with the blood of American service members, okay? So now let's jump back to present day now that we understand that, okay? So now, today, the United States government continues to be the largest financial backer of Ukraine. With the current budget deficit, much of this will inevitably end up with the United States' growing debt burden. And the European banks want some also. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development deployed some 1.7 billion euros to Ukraine for investments in vital infrastructure, energy and food security, and of course support for the private sector in 2022. This includes providing hundreds of millions to Ukraine's railway companies, their operator, their gas firms, their private sector companies. The lender says it's on track to take the total amount to 3 billion euros by the end of this year. Now, of course, in the United States, President Biden signed the Lend-Lease Act, which of course cuts the red tape. Right? Or as they'd say, it waives the time-consuming requirements to get the money. Basically, the U.S. sends supplies and equipment overseas, and it's technically a drawdown. It's a loan. So it's a loan, a drawdown on our national stockpiles and inventory. And then, of course, our own Department of Defense has to replace the equipment that was loaned out to Ukraine, right? Loaned out, which of course is absolute goldmine for defense contractors because, of course, these DoD contractors need more money and the U.S. has to issue more debt. And the good old U.S. banks sitting in the middle of it collect their fees from the whole thing, all the transactions. Now, where does this leave us and how can we use this hopefully fun history lesson to help us tell what the future holds? Well, U.S. General Mark Milley said last year that they expect the war in Ukraine to likely be protracted for years, not months, for years. And of course, we already see all the major banks lining up to fund Ukraine's rebuilding efforts. First in line, of course, JP Morgan. And more importantly, you know why the U.S. has to be involved in this war, because who's going to pay the banks and the banksters? Who's going to pay them back if Ukraine loses the war, right? Which they most certainly would if it wasn't for the U.S. turning this into a global nuclear threat. Now, because in the event that Ukraine did lose, who would pay back the banks? Well, that'd be you, the taxpayer. So I think they kind of told us what comes next, and that is the U.S. That tells us why the U.S. is committed to doing this and however long it takes or whatever that is. I hope that history doesn't repeat, but I guess time will tell. Let me know what you think. Do you think history repeats? Does it rhyme? And do you think the banksters are going to lose? Because so far they never have. That's what I got. Hopefully you liked it. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up. If you don't, you can give me a thumbs down. At least leave me a comment why. If you think I got the history wrong, please feel free to correct me in the comments. Hit that subscribe button while you're at it. And that's what I got. To your success. I'm out.